The Little Rock Nine is a group of 9 Black students who enrolled at the formerly all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in the September of 1957. Their attendance at school was to test of Brown versus the Board of Education that had declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. And if this is the type of content that you enjoy, you can find more content like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on my Patreon page and my Buy Me Coffee in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get started. May 17, 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in United States public schools was unconstitutional. Until that decision, many states across the nation had laws making segregation mandatory, requiring African Americans and white children to attend separate schools. Resistance to the ruling was so widespread that the court had to issue a second decision in 1955, known as Brown 2, ordering school districts to integrate with deliberate speed. In response to the Brown decision and pressure from the local chapter of the NAACP, the Little Rock, Arkansas School Board adopted a plan for gradual integration of its schools. The first institution that would be integrated would be the high schools, beginning in September of 1957. Among them was Little Rock Central High School. Despite heavy opposition, 9 Black students registered to be the first African Americans to attend Central High School. Minnie Jean Brown, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mothership, Mabel Plateau, Gloria Ray, Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, and Carlotta Walls. These 9 Black students became the center of the struggle for desegregation of public schools in the United States. Before enrolling in Little Rock Central High School, the Arkansas NAACP carefully vetted the group of students and determined that they all possessed the strength and determination necessary to face the resistance that they would inevitably encounter. In the weeks prior to the start of the new school year, the students participated in intensive counseling sessions guiding them on what to expect once classes began and how to respond to anticipated hostility. September 2nd, 1957, Governor Orville Flabus announced that he would call the National Guard to prevent students from entry into the high school, claiming that the action was for the students' own protection, stating that they were there to maintain and restore order. In a television address, Flabus insisted that violence and bloodshed would break out if the 9 Black students were allowed to enter the school. September 3rd, though, federal judge Ron Davies issued a ruling that desegregation would continue as planned on the next day, the first day of the school year. September 4th, 1957, the first day of school at Central High, 8 students gathered together by Daisy Bates, president of the Arkansas chapter of the NAACP. But the Elizabeth Eckford's family did not have a telephone, and no one could reach her to let her know the carpool plans or the arrangement to gather at 16th Street entrance with several local ministers accompanying them. So Elizabeth Eckford arrived alone on the other side of the block with 270 soldiers from the Arkansas National Guard ordered to prevent any of the Little Rock 9 from entering the doors of Central High. What happened next continues to be one of the enduring images from the incident, with Eckford walking along stoically approaching the school as a crowd of hostile screaming white students and adults surrounded her. Eckford later recalled that they moved closer and closer and somebody started yelling, and I tried to see a friendly face in the crowd to see someone that could help me, and I looked into the face of an old woman and she seemed to have a kind face, but when I looked at her again, she spit on me. The image was printed across the United States, bringing international attention to Arkansas' opposition to integration and their intention to defy the federal order requiring desegregation. Television and newspaper reports devoted substantial coverage to the Little Rock 9. More than 2 weeks would go by before the Little Rock 9 would again attempt to enter Central High School. During that time, the 9 students stayed home, and federal judge Ron Davies would begin legal proceedings against Governor Flabus. President Dwight Eisenhower would attempt to try to persuade Flabus to remove the National Guard and let the Little Rock 9 enter the school. Judge Davies ordered the guard removed on September 20th, and the Little Rock Police Department took over maintaining order. The Little Rock police escorted the 9 students into a side door of the school on September 3rd, and an angry mob of some 1,000 protesters gathered outside. Amidst the ensuing riot and fearing for the lives of the 9 students, school officials sent the teens home. They managed to attend class for just 3 hours. The following day, Woodrow Wilson Mann, mayor of Little Rock, asked President Eisenhower to send federal troops to enforce integration and protect the 9 students. Eisenhower would invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807 to enable troops to perform domestic law enforcement. The president ordered the 101 Airborne Division of the United States Army, without their black soldiers, by the way, to Little Rock and federalized the entire Arkansas National Guard, removing them from the governor's control. The Little Rock 9 attended school on their first full school day, September 25th, 1957. The rest of the school year, the Little Rock Nine would be under the protection of the 101 Airborne and later the Arkansas National Guard. They were still subjected to physical and verbal abuse by the white students. Melba Patillo later recalled having acid thrown in her eyes and another incident in which a group of girls trapped her in a stall of the women's bathroom and attempted to burn her by dropping pieces of flaming paper on her from above. The 9 students were told that they would have to take a lot and were warned not to fight back if anything were to happen. So when Minnie Jean Brown was taunted by a group of white males in December 1957 in the school cafeteria during lunch, she dropped a bowl of chili on one of the boys and was suspended for 6 days. After another confrontation, she was expelled. Brown would transfer to New Lincoln High School in New York, and the 8 remaining students, however, would attend school the rest of the academic school year. After the end of the year in 1958, senior Ernest Green would become the first African American to graduate from Little Rock Central High School. In September of 1958, as the school year was drawing to a close, Governor Flavis decided to petition the decision by the federal district court in order to postpone desegregation of public schools in Little Rock. In the case of Cooper versus Aaron, the Little Rock School District fought to delay desegregation for 2.5 years. This meant that black students wouldn't be permitted to enter public high schools until January in 1961. Governor Flavis argued that schools remain integrated, that it would increase the violence. However, in August of 1958, federal courts ruled against the delay on desegregation, so Flavis called an emergency extraordinary session of the state legislature in order to enact his new segregation bills. Claiming that Arkansas had to assert their rights and freedoms against the federal decision, in September 1958, Governor Flavis signed acts enabling him to close all the high schools in the Little Rock School District. Thus, Monday, September 15th, Governor Flavis ordered the closure of all public high schools, preventing both black and white students from attending school in Little Rock. Despite the bill, the city's population had a chance to stop the school closures because it necessitated a referendum. The referendum would either condone or condemn the closure of the schools. However, a week before the referendum, Flavis addressed the citizens of Little Rock in an attempt to secure their votes. He urged the population to vote against integration because he had plans on leasing the public high schools to private schools, therefore would continue to educate black and white students separately. Flavis' appeal was successful and the referendum won, and this period in Little Rock is known as the Lost Year. Flavis' victory led to a series of consequences that rippled through Little Rock. Flavis and the school board intention on opening private schools was blocked by an injunction by the 8th District Court of Appeals, which caused citizens of Little Rock to take their anger out on the black community. White Little Rock's community blamed the black community for the closure of the schools and made them a target for hate crimes. President of the Arkansas branch of the NAACP, Daisy Bates, was the primary victim of these crimes. Her involvement in the Little Rock Nine resulted in a loss of advertising revenue for her paper, Arkansas State Press, and forced it to close in 1959, leading to Daisy Bates moving to New York in 1960. May of 1959, the school board fired 44 teachers and administrative staff from the closed high schools, leading to 3 segregationist board members being replaced with 3 moderate ones. The new members reinstated the fired staff and attempted to reopen schools, much to the dismay of Governor Flavis. High schools reopened August 12, 1959. Although the lost year was over and black students returned to now integrated high schools, but they weren't welcomed by the other students. Black students still had a difficult time getting past white mobs entering the school, and once inside, they were often subject to physical and emotional abuse. The lost year would be used as a pretext for a new brand of hatred towards black students in Little Rock high schools. The Little Rock Nine is widely recognized for the significant role in the civil rights movement. Little Rock Central High School still functions under the Little Rock School District. It's now a historical site that houses a civil rights museum to commemorate the events of the Little Rock Nine. Also, Daisy Bates' home was designated a National Historical Landmark in 2001 for her role in the events. In 1999, President Bill Clinton honored the Little Rock Nine when he presented them with the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress and is given to those who provided outstanding service to this country. Ruby Neal Bridges was the first African-American child to desegregate the all-white William Frantz Elementary in New Orleans, Louisiana, November 14, 1960. Ruby Bridges was born September 8, 1954. Bridges was the oldest of 5 children to Lucille and Albone Bridges. They were farmers in Tylertown, Mississippi. Both of her grandparents were sharecroppers, so in 1958, when Ruby was just 4 years old, her family moved to New Orleans, Louisiana in search of better work opportunities. Her father got a job as a gas station attendant, and her mother worked nights to help support her growing family. Bridges was actually born the same year that the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, ruling that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. Nonetheless, Southern states continued to resist integration, and by 1957, less than 2% of Southern schools were integrated. By 1959, Ruby was attending kindergarten at the segregated, all-black Johnson Lockett Elementary. But by early 1960, however, federal district court judge Wright ordered the New Orleans School Board to formulate a plan to integrate their public schools. And New Orleans School Board chose to integrate 2 formerly all-white schools, William Frantz and McDowell Elementary, in the fall of 1960. Spring of 1960, the school board created an entrance exam for African-American students to see whether or not they could compete academically with the white students. Those that were chosen and passed were allowed to attend the white schools. The test was written specifically to be difficult so the students would have a hard time passing, with the idea being that if black students failed the test, New Orleans might be able to fend off integration a little while longer. Bridges lived just 5 blocks from William Frantz Elementary, but she had to attend kindergarten several miles away at Johnson Lockett Elementary. Initially, Bridges' father was averse to his daughter taking the test, believing that if she passed and was allowed to go to the white school, there would be trouble. However, her mother pressed the issue, believing that Bridges would get a better education and be allowed educational opportunities that her parents had been denied. She was eventually able to convince Bridges' father to let her take the test. Her parents were informed by the NAACP that she was one of only 6 black children who were able to pass the test. 2 other students decided not to leave their schools at all, and the other 3 were sent to the all-white McDowell Elementary. Bridges would be the only African-American student to attend William Frantz Elementary and the first black child to attend an all-white elementary in the entire South. However, September of 1960, when the first day of school rolled around and the school district was still dragging its feet and Bridges was still at her old school. During this time, the Louisiana state legislature found ways to fight the federal court order and slow the integration process. After exhausting all of their stalling tactics, the legislature had to relent and designated that schools were to be integrated November 14, 1960. Fearing that there might be some issues, Federal District Court Judge Wright requested that the United States government rush federal marshals to New Orleans to protect the black first graders. November 13th, Ruby Bridges' mother told her that she would be starting a new school, but didn't explain the complexities of the situation, only stating that you don't need to be afraid, that I'll be with you. On the morning of November 14th, federal marshals drove Bridges and her mother the 5 blocks to school. While in the car, one of them explained that when she arrived at school, the marshals would walk in the front of Bridges and 2 would walk behind Bridges. When Bridges and the federal marshals arrived at school, large crowds were gathered out front, yelling and throwing objects. There were barricades set up and police were everywhere. Bridges thought that the crowds were there for a Mardi Gras celebration, and the image of this tiny little black girl and her escort of federal marshals calmly walking through the crowd of rabid segregationists spread across the United States. The crowds made her think that this was an important place, and Ruby initially thought that she was in college. When she entered the school under the protection of federal marshals, she was immediately escorted to the principal's office and would spend the entire day there with her mother. The chaos outside and the fact that nearly all of the white parents had kept their children home and all but one teacher had stayed home in protest of desegregation meant that she had no classroom to go to. Many segregationists simply withdrew their kids from the school permanently, and even at home after the first day, police set up barricades at the end of her block, and only local residents were allowed on her street. On her second day, it was very much like the first. For a while, it looked like Bridges wouldn't be able to attend class. The only teacher, Barbara Henry, was willing to teach Bridges. She was from Boston and a new teacher at the school. Bridges was her only student in her class because all of the parents had pulled their children from Bridges' class. By November 5th of 1960, only 18 students attended class at William Frantz Elementary. Ruby Bridges' mother would sit with her through her entire second day of school, but after that, Ruby would have to attend school alone. Barbara Henry was very supportive of Bridges, not only helping her with her studies, but also helping her with the difficult experience of being ostracized. Ruby Bridges would later state that Barbara Henry was the nicest teacher that she had ever had. Ruby's first few weeks at William Frantz Elementary were not easy ones. Ruby sat with Miss Henry as mobs of protesters roamed the streets attempting to throw rocks and bricks at passing cars. White segregationists left burning crosses in black neighborhoods as a warning, and some parents even traveled to Baton Rouge to attempt to have federal judge J. Skelly Wright removed from office. Ruby was confronted several times with blatant racism. On the second day of school, a woman threatened to poison her, and on another day she was greeted with a woman displaying a black doll in a wooden coffin. After this, federal marshals only allowed her to eat food from home, and she would recall that this was the only time she was actually frightened. Ruby would spend her entire day every day in Miss Henry's classroom. She was not allowed to go to the cafeteria or out to recess with the other students because it was deemed too dangerous. And when she did go to the bathroom, federal marshals would walk her to the restroom. Despite these hardships, she never missed a day of school. Several years later, one of her escorts, Federal Marshal Charles Burks, would comment with pride talking about Bridges showing a lot of courage. She never cried, she never whimpered. She just marched on like a little soldier. After winter break, though, Bridges would show signs of stress. She was experiencing nightmares and would wake her mother up in the middle of the night. For a time, she had stopped eating her sandwiches that her mother packed for her and would hide them in the storage cabinet in her classroom because she wanted to eat with the other students. Soon, the janitor discovered it because it was covered in mice and cockroaches, and the incident led Miss Henry to start eating lunch with Bridges in the classroom. Ruby would also start seeing the child psychologist, a Dr. Robert Coles, who volunteered to provide counseling her first year of school. He was very concerned about how such a young girl would be able to handle the pressures that were being placed on her. During the sessions, he would just let her talk about her experiences, and later on he wrote a series of articles in Atlantic Monthly and eventually published a series of books about how children handle change, including a children's book on Ruby Bridges' experiences. The abuse was not only limited to Ruby Bridges. Her family suffered greatly because of their decision to integrate William Frantz Elementary. Ruby did not notice at the time, but her parents were also afraid for their lives. There was a very real possibility that they could be lynched by the mob, but they never communicated this to their kids. Her father also lost his job at the filling station, and her grandparents were sent off their land they had sharecropped for over 25 years. The grocery store where the family shopped also banned them from entering. However, many in the community, both black and white, began to show support in a variety of ways. People across the country sent in money and gifts to help, and the neighbor provided Ruby Bridges' father with a job. Also, volunteers helped babysit the other 4 children. Some even walked behind the federal marshal on her trips to school. Ruby Bridges would even receive a letter from former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Near the end of the first year, things began to settle down. Gradually, families began to let their children go back to school, and the protests began to subside as the year went on. Occasionally, Bridges got to go outside and visit with some of the other children. By her own recollection, many years later, she was not fully aware to the extent of racism that had erupted over her attempting to attend a segregated school. But after another child refused to play with Bridges because she was black, she slowly began to understand. Ruby spent the entire first grade year receiving one-on-one instruction from Barbara Henry and being escorted to and from school by U.S. Marshals. But the following year, everything had changed. The school had become further integrated. Miss Henry's contract had not been renewed. She and her husband moved back to Boston. There were no more federal marshals, and Bridges walked to school every day by herself and attended class with both black and white children without incident. No one talked about the previous year, and everyone seemed to want to put last year's experiences behind them. In 1963, painter Norman Rockwell created Bridges' monumental first day to school in a painting. It's called The Problem That We All Live With, and the image of a small black girl being escorted into school by 4 large white men graced the cover of Look magazine, January 14, 1964. 1995, Robert Henry contacted Bridges and they reunited on The Oprah Winfrey Show. In 1999, Bridges formed the Ruby Bridges Foundation, headquartered in New Orleans. Bridges was inspired by the murder of her youngest brother, Malcolm Bridges, and a drug-related incident in 1993. For a time, Ruby Bridges looked over Malcolm's 4 children, and they all attended William Frantz Elementary. She soon became a volunteer there 3 days a week and became a parent community liaison, which by that time was a majority African-American school. Ruby's experience as a liaison, she began to see the need for parents to take an active role in their kids' education. So Ruby Bridges launched the foundation to promote the values of tolerance, respect, and appreciation of each other's differences. Through education and inspiration, the foundation seeks to end racism and prejudice, and its motto is, racism is a grown-up disease and we must stop using our children to spread it. Today, Ruby Bridges is still an outspoken civil rights activist and an icon of the civil rights movement. She has published several books and especially wants kids to learn to be kind to one another. She states that there's a message that it often leaves with kids. It's that racism has no place in our hearts and minds of children. If we're going to get past our racial differences, I believe it's going to come from our kids. What I find is that my story resonates with kids. They put themselves in the shoes of that little girl and they understand the loneliness and they understand someone not wanting to play with them. And I think they get it. Thank you. This has been the story of Ruby Bridges, and I'm your host, Country Boy. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on Buy Me Coffee on my Patreon page in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.